Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're taking a close look at something really fundamental to, well, how knowledge travels around the world. Academic writing in English.
Mhm.
Specifically, we're diving into a really interesting study. It looks at how experienced non-native English speakers, people using English as a lingua franca, ELF,
Right.
how they build those crucial informational packets in their sentences, noun phrases.
That's right. Yeah, our source material is a research paper by Napazri Timyam, published in the Learn Journal 2024. And it takes a deep dive
Yeah.
statistically into academic manuscripts.
Okay.
These are written by ELF authors, people working in language and linguistics.
Right. And our mission here for this deep dive is really to unpack what this study tells us about the strategies these ELF authors are using. Because academic writing, it demands, well, both packing lots of information and
Conciseness, yeah.
exactly conciseness and making sure it's absolutely clear, explicitness,
Mhm.
especially when you're writing for a global audience, people with really diverse linguistic backgrounds.
Absolutely. And this research, it's important to say, it isn't about comparing ELF writing to some kind of, idealized native standard.
No.
It's about understanding the smart, functional choices these authors are making to succeed in, well, international academia.
Okay, so let's maybe set the scene first. Talk about ELF itself.
Sure. So,
Yeah.
English, it's just not primarily the language of native speakers anymore, is it?
Yeah.
In a globalized world, it's used overwhelmingly as a lingua franca, between non-native speakers.
It really is the global connector. And academia is right there, in the middle of it all. You think about international collaborations, journals, universities. English is that common ground for sharing research everywhere.
And the academic ELF perspective is really key here. It views people using ELF not as like learners who are just making mistakes compared to a native norm,
Right.
but as sophisticated language users.
Right.
People who adapt English purposefully, for their specific communication goals.
Which kind of brings us to the traditional view of academic writing style. You might think of it as being, well, really elaborate,
Complex.
full of long, complex sentences, lots of subordinate clauses, like saying an orientation which is theoretical and which focuses on the analysis of systems.
Something like that.
Exactly, that kind of structure. But linguistic research, like Biber and Gray's work, it's shown a pretty significant shift in modern academic writing.
Oh, really? How so?
There's a move towards a more compressed style. So instead of those long clauses, writers increasingly prefer to pack information into noun phrases
Okay.
using lexical or phrasal modifiers. So that elaborated phrase you mentioned, it becomes the much tighter a systems theoretical orientation.
Ah, okay. So you're basically condensing the clause, the information from the clause, into the noun phrase itself using modifiers.
Precisely. The drive is economy of expression. It's about getting complex information across densely so that expert readers who already have the background context can process it quickly. But isn't there a potential trade-off there? If you condense it too much, maybe?
Well, yeah.
Do you lose some of that explicit grammatical signaling you get in a clause?
That's the potential challenge, exactly. A single word modifier, like an adjective or a noun, might not spell out the exact relationship to the head noun quite as clearly as, say, a preposition or a relative clause would.
Right.
So this could potentially make those super dense phrases a bit harder to decode, especially for someone less familiar with the field or the conventions.
And this tension, this push and pull between being concise and being explicit, that's exactly what this study looks at, right? But in the context of ELF academic writing.
Precisely.
Okay, so let's zoom in on the star of the show then. The noun phrase. What exactly are we talking about, just simply?
Okay, simply put, yeah. A noun phrase is built around a head noun, and it includes all the words that modify or specify it. Things like determiners, adjectives, other nouns, phrases.
A whole package around the noun. And the study looked at different types of these modifiers.
Yes, they categorize them based on their form. So you have single words like adjectives, nouns used as modifiers, participles. Then you have phrases, prepositional phrases, appositives, and finally, clauses, non-finite and finite ones.
And these different forms relate back to that idea of structural compression you mentioned.
They do, yeah. The study uses that concept. Basically, the more information you pack into fewer grammatical units, the more compressed it is.
Okay.
So single words are highly compressed. Clauses are much less so. There's kind of scale or cline, as linguists call it. It goes from words, adjectives, participles, nouns being most compressed,
Right.
through phrases like prepositional and appositive phrases down to clauses non-finite. then finite relative clauses being the least compressed.
Okay, so the landscape is set. We understand ELF, academic style shifts, noun phrases, compression. Tell us about the study itself. How did they actually investigate this?
So the researchers, they wanted to see if this modern compressed style of academic writing is, well, common in ELF writing, and crucially, how that interacts with the need for explicitness, which is so important, obviously, in international communication.
Makes sense. What kind of data did they use? Where did they get it from?
They analyzed 60 research articles. These were submitted to a Scopus Index journal based in Thailand between 2020 and 2022. And these were written by non-native English-speaking scholars from various countries, all focusing on language and linguistics.
And they looked at specific parts of those papers, I assume, not the whole thing.
Yeah, that's right. They focus on the introduction and methods sections. These parts are really vital for, establishing the research context and describing the work precisely. So they're usually rich ground for finding lots of noun phrases.
Good place to look. How did they approach analyzing the grammar, though, given that it's ELF, not native English?
This is a really key point. It reflects that ELF perspective we talked about.
Yeah.
They didn't measure it against native speaker norms. Instead, they used the concept of intelligibility. Basically, was the meaning clear and understandable in context, even if the structure might look a bit different from, say, standard native speaker patterns.
So they included phrases that might look maybe grammatically unconventional to some, but were perfectly understandable.
Exactly. As long as the meaning was clear within that academic discourse, they included it.
That feels like a much more, realistic approach for studying ELF, doesn't it?
It does, yeah.
And did they have a rigorous method for coding to make sure they were consistent?
Oh, yeah. They manually coded all the noun phrases, thousands of them. And then they had other experts code a subset to check for consistency, intercoder reliability. They achieved high agreement rates, which suggests the analysis was pretty robust.
All right, let's get to the core findings then. What did they actually discover? How are these ELF authors building their noun phrases?
Well, what's really striking, first off, is just the sheer volume of complex noun phrases.
Yeah.
Out of 6,545 identified noun phrases in total, 70%, 68.16% to be exact, were complex, meaning they had at least one modifier. Only about, 32% were simple noun phrases.
So these aren't simple sentences at all. These authors are definitely building sophisticated noun structures, packing in a lot of information.
Absolutely. And when they looked at what kind of modifiers were most popular in those complex phrases, a really clear pattern emerged.
Okay.
Prepositional phrases were the runaway favorite. They made up almost 35%, 34.84% of all modifiers.
Huh. Prepositional phrases. Okay, what else?
Adjectives came next at about 27%, 26.69%. And then nouns used as modifiers, they accounted for just under 11%, 10.88%.
So prepositional phrases, adjectives, nouns, those are the top three. Were those preferences pretty consistent across the years they studied?
Yes, the study specifically noted remarkable consistency. The proportion of these top three modifier types stayed pretty stable across the 3 years of data.
Interesting. So how does this fit with that modern trend towards compression we talked about earlier?
All right, this is where the insight really starts to build. Remember that client of compression. Words like adjectives and nouns are the most compressed, and phrases like prepositional phrases are next.
Yeah.
Well, the study found that modifiers classified as words, so adjectives, nouns, participles combined, accounted for almost 45% of the total. 44.76%.
Okay, nearly half.
And phrases, mostly those prepositional phrases, but also appositives, accounted for over 43%.
43.22%.
So if you combine those two,
Right.
words and phrases, that's nearly 88%.
Exactly. Almost 88% of all modifiers were either words or phrases. In stark contrast, clause-based modifiers, the least compressed forms, like relative clauses, accounted for only about 12%.
Wow. Okay, so that clearly shows these ELF authors are adopting that modern academic writing strategy. They're using highly compressed forms.
Definitely, they're conforming to that trend.
Okay, so they are prioritizing conciseness. But the big question then is, how do they manage that while also ensuring clarity, ensuring explicitness, especially for that global, diverse audience? Right. And this is where the findings get really interesting and reveal the strategic choices being made. The study also looked at noun phrases that had multiple modifiers.
Yeah.
Layered structures.
Ah, okay. Like several adjectives or an adjective and a prepositional phrase.
Exactly. And while these layered structures definitely existed, the key finding is that they were generally not highly complex.
What does not highly complex actually look like in the data? What does that mean?
It means that even when authors used multiple modifiers in a single noun phrase, they tended to limit the stacking, layering.
Mm-hmm.
So among those phrases with multiple pre-modifiers, modifiers before the noun, over 93% had only two.
Just two.
And it was almost identical for post-modifiers, the ones after the noun. Over 92% of those also had just two.
Ah.
And the most common pattern they found for phrases that had both pre- and post-modifiers was simply one adjective before the noun, followed by one prepositional phrase after it. That pattern alone accounted for over 32% of those mixed types.
So they are using those compressed forms we talked about, adjectives and PPs, but they're generally not chaining like lots and lots of them together in one massive noun phrase.
Precisely. It seems by limiting the number of layers, they keep the overall structure simpler. And arguably, that makes it easier to process, easier to understand, compared to a noun phrase with maybe 5 or 6 embedded modifiers all piled up.
So that's one way they maintain clarity, keeping the structure relatively simple, even when using multiple modifiers. It's like a move towards structural explicitness.
Exactly. Structural simplicity aids clarity.
Did the study look at the meaning carried by these modifiers too? Like what kind of information are they packing in?
They did, yeah. They focused on the most frequent types. So for nouns used as pre-modifiers like data sources or language learning, they found these weren't just used for concrete things.
Oh.
No, they expressed a really wide range of meanings. The most common semantic categories were actually intangibles, things like gender equality, that was almost 48%, and process activities like pronunciation problems, that was about 31%.
Interesting. So using a noun as a modifier is a really versatile tool for abstract concepts too, not just physical objects.
Yes, definitely. And they found something similar for the post-modifying in prepositional phrases, phrases starting with in.
Like students in Thailand.
Right. While concrete locations like in Korean or in Thailand were frequent, sure, there was also really extensive use for abstract concepts, things like relevance to a topic, in this field that was over 18%, or describing a process like in establishing identities, nearly 17.5%.
Okay. So these preferred modifiers, nouns and PPs, they're doing a lot of functional work, carrying complex meaning, both concrete and abstract.
Absolutely. They're semantically quite rich.
Okay, let's try and pull these threads together then. How do these specific findings, the preference for PPs, adjectives, nouns, but limiting the layering, how does this show ELF authors performing that balancing act between conciseness and explicitness?
Right. This is the core insight I think the study offers. By heavily using these lexical and phrasal modifiers, adjectives, nouns, and especially those very frequent prepositional phrases, they are clearly embracing the modern academic trend towards conciseness.
Right, packing information efficiently into the name phrase unit.
Exactly. That's the conciseness part.
Okay. So how do they ensure the explicitness, the clarity alongside this compression?
The studies suggest they do it in two key ways, based on the patterns we just discussed. First, by limiting the depth of layering in those complex noun phrases.
Keeping the structure relatively shallow.
Yeah. Keeping the structure relatively simple, with usually just 1 or 2 modifiers, makes it less likely to be structurally ambiguous, easier to parse.
Okay, limiting structural complexity. What's the second way?
The second, and perhaps the most significant strategy, seems to be their strong preference for prepositional phrases. Remember, PPs were the most frequent type.
Yeah, by quite a margin.
Now, while PPs are more compressed than, say, full clauses, they're actually less compressed than single words like adjectives or nouns.
Right, a few more words.
A few more words, but they offer a really significant advantage for clarity, for explicitness, and that's the preposition itself, the in, of, for, on.
Ah, I see where you're going. The preposition explicitly signals the relationship.
Exactly. It provides an explicit grammatical marker of the semantic relationship between the head noun and the modifier phrase.
So, like your earlier example saying a benefit of reading uses of to clearly state the connection, whereas in a reading benefit, you kind of have to infer that relationship yourself.
Precisely. The preposition acts like a little signpost for meaning. It guides the reader. The study gives another example like the torment in his mind due to loneliness and homesickness. The prepositions in and due to clearly mark the location and the reason for the torment. That kind of explicit marking really helps ensure clarity. And that's crucial when your readers might come from very different linguistic backgrounds and might not share all the same implicit understandings that maybe native speakers take for granted.
So it's a strategic choice. They could be maximally concise, perhaps, by using even more single-word modifiers, but they often choose to be slightly less compressed by using prepositional phrases in order to gain that crucial boost in semantic explicitness.
That's exactly the balancing act this study seems to reveal. It looks like an effective choice, a trade-off, navigating that tension between packing information in densely and making sure it's unambiguously understood by a global readership.
So these noun phrase structures aren't just random or errors or deviations from some norm.
No, not at all. The study argues they emerge from functional needs. They are shaped, adapted to facilitate global academic communication and to minimize potential misinterpretations in that diverse context.
It really highlights the dynamic, adaptive nature of ELF.
It does.
And if we connect this to the bigger picture of ELF communication, it really underscores that idea that variability isn't necessarily a flaw. It can be a feature, right? An adaptation to specific situational demands.
Absolutely. Academic ELF, based on this, isn't just trying to uniformly imitate native speaker norms.
Yeah.
It seems to be developing its own effective patterns, tailored to the specific context and the needs of its users, balancing conciseness and explicitness.
Which, of course, has implications for, say, how we teach English.
Oh, for sure.
Yeah.
It certainly does. Recognizing these kinds of functional adaptations in ELF academic writing suggests that, well, maybe English language teaching should move beyond solely focusing on native speaker norms.
Yeah.
It should probably acknowledge the reality of global Englishes and empower students to see themselves not just as learners, but as active strategic users of the language, users who can adapt it effectively for different international contexts.
Makes a lot of sense. Now, the study does note some limitations, right? As all good research does.
Yes, absolutely. They mention a few things, like the difficulty of definitively confirming the non-native status of every single author.
Right.
Also, the possibility that some papers might have received some level of native speaker editing before submission, which could influence the findings.
True.
And of course, the data was limited to one specific journal and primarily the fields of language and linguistics. So these findings might not generalize perfectly across all academic disciplines or all publication venues. Some fields might have different conventions.
Fair points. Standard limitations in this kind of work. But the core insights about the noun phrase strategies, they still seem pretty well supported by the data they did analyze.
I'd agree, yes. The patterns were quite clear in their data set.
Okay. So wrapping this up, the key takeaway from this deep dive seems to be that ELF authors in academic writing are demonstrating a really clear strategic navigation of that concise versus explicit dilemma. They adopt the modern trend of conciseness, using those compressed noun phrase structures, words, and phrases, but they cleverly temper potential ambiguity. How? By limiting the complexity of layering.
Right, keeping structures relatively simple.
And, perhaps most significantly, by heavily favoring those semantically explicit prepositional phrases, even if they're slightly less compressed than single words.
Yeah, it's a really clear demonstration, I think, of how experienced language users adapt to English. They turn it into a highly functional tool, fit for purpose in global knowledge exchange.
Which leaves us, and you listening, with this final thought maybe. What does this kind of research really suggest about our traditional ideas of correctness or effectiveness in English, especially when it's used internationally as a lingua franca? And how does understanding these sophisticated ELF strategies challenge those older views about, who owns English or how it should be used in global contexts, something to mull over?